Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. This is going to be take 2 of this recording because I actually just lectured for 30 minutes at my computer screen and the recording deleted. So you're getting round 2 of this lecture. So I hope I don't skip anything. And we'll dive right in. Today is the second day on timbre, and there are a few opportunities in this to pause, where I'll ask you to pause this video and then move over to the links that I've posted in e-learning and do your listenings there. So with this video combined with the listening activities, we should end up with approximately a class period. Right? So here's a quick review of the different things that we did in the last class to talk about timbre decisions. Different terms that we've gone over, at different timbre terms. Families of instruments are the ones you're most familiar with: woodwind, brass, percussion, strings, voices. And I would go ahead and flag this part of the slideshow of the video today, because you may want to come back and take a look at this as we're doing some of these activities. Again, the classifications of instruments, there we go down here, these sax classifications are different ways of categorizing instruments by how they make a sound, right? So this is why we can make certain parallels between woodwind and brass instruments, even though they're not necessarily the same instrument. This is why strings and voices are often paired more easily than voice and percussion, right? Because they're both of the same family. The fun trivia that I've been told many, many times is that the sound of the cello is acoustically the most similar sound that there is to a human voice. The nature of the chordophone of the cello string instrument sounds the most like the human voice. Right? So those are the terms that we're going to be used today as we're practicing going through some different timbres. So the first thing I'd like for you to do is pause this video and then take a look at the link for Peter and the Wolf. There should be Peter and the Wolf linked on the e-learning. Listen through. You can kind of jump around a little bit and identify some of these different characters that you hear represented by different instruments. And our task is just kind of figure out what is it about the timbre that makes it sound like that character. So go ahead and hit pause and come back and hit play on this video when you're ready for us to review together. All right, welcome back. The different instruments that you may have heard at some point: the bird represented by the flute, the duck was represented by the oboe, the clarinet played the cat, the wolf was a French horn, the bassoon, as much as I am not one of these, the bassoon was the grandfather, the hunters were represented by timpani, and Peter himself was the string section, or the violins. So there are certain timbre associations that we have with these different instruments that make this make sense. Right? Birds are, in most Western classical music, represented by the flute, because we have this airy sound of the flute that's light and sparkly. We associate it with things being up high, right? The bird being high in the sky is one of the most common stereotypes for a flute in orchestra. The duck and the oboe is a little more onomatopoeia than perhaps the timbre. The timbre of the oboe does sort of have a quacky, buzzy quality to it. Sounds the most like the quacking of a duck. Right? A cat, if you imagine kind of a silky house cat with really smooth fur, the smooth, dark, rich sound of the clarinet that's very clean. Right? It sounds like a cat. The wolf, with its growling, kind of aggressive nature, being represented by a member of the brass family that's able to really growl. The grandfather, with the low, gravelly sound of the bassoon, representing the low, gravelly sound of the old grandfather's voice. And then Peter himself, with that sort of walking motive in the melodic aspect, right? Walking along, but the very light-hearted, bright sound of the upper strings, representing that bright nature, the boyishness of Peter himself. So for this activity, I would like you to write a story for this work. This is one of my favorite activities to do in class, and so I'm a little sad that we don't get to do it all together, but your task is to identify these different instruments that are associated with each character or action in your story, and then go ahead and practice naming their families and classifications, right? And as we go through this, there is a story that was intended by this work. So write your own story first, and then we'll kind of compare and see how the different instruments were crucial in developing the different characters in your story. So what I'd like for you to do now is shift over to the e-learning links and open up the video for Richard Strauss's Don Juan and fast forward to 5.5 minutes in and listen for a couple minutes, 5 minutes, 5:30 to about 7:30, and just identify what do you think this piece is going to be about. Right, so you should have probably, let me count up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 main sections or different characters that happen. So come up with your brief story as to what's happening in those 2 minutes of music. Go ahead and pause this video and jump on over to Don Juan. All right, welcome back. You should have your various sections or to go from 5.5 minutes to 7.5 minutes. The first thing that you heard was this really aggressive string section with really bright timbres and the brassiness of the trumpet that was kind of edgy, that moved into this really luscious, rich sound of all the low strings. There were violas, cellos, basses, right? All of those low instruments with their really vibrant sounds, very velvety, right? Depicting that second section. And then we heard a shift over into the woodwind section, a feature for the flute that was kind of light and airy and maybe a little bit ungrounded, and it sounded sort of whimsical in the flute section. And then you heard the return of those strong strings and that triumphant trumpet melody for just a moment. And then we heard the entrance of a long solo on the oboe that was a little more grounded, a little deeper. Perhaps you associated with loving, right? That there were a few different points in that story. So make sure you have your story handy because I'll ask you to do something with it at the end of this video. But if we look at what Strauss's intent was, if you're familiar with the legend of Don Juan, then you may, or the story of Don Juan, right? This may be familiar to you, but the story itself, Don Juan is a womanizer, or was a womanizer, right? Notorious for bounding about his country and the world, taking advantage and seducing women, and just sort of leaving them as soon as he was done with them. And so as we look at this section with sort of the most standard interpretation of what's going on in the music for these 2 minutes, right, you get the depiction of the strong and sort of cocky character of Don Juan, and that edgy trumpet sound and the large leaps in the violin, something very bright and very powerful, that is also indicated, or his actions that are indicated by this really, the thick low string, this very deep sounding music is depicting his lustful nature, right, being very, I guess, open with his various crowds of people, right? It's a very thick orchestration. There's a lot going on. It has a darker timbre, so we tend to associate that with something that perhaps happened at night, right? Some more lustful music in the middle, right? And then you hear a depiction of a woman, perhaps a woman with a little less substance, shall we? Right, by the sound of the flute that is a little less kind of substantive, right? It's very whimsical, if you will, and his flirtation with this flute woman is short, right? The trumpet returns. He's done with her rather immediately, and then we get another woman that comes onto the scene, somebody with a little more substance, who lasts a little bit longer, who stays around, who stays in this piece of music, who stays in his life a little bit longer, and is more prominent melodically. Right, that long oboe line, there's not much else going on underneath that. The flute was a little bit interrupted. There was a lot going on. There's a lot of busyness. The oboe really takes the center stage and represents that first woman. And then she too is cast aside, and we get the return of Don Juan's character halfway through the piece. So what I'd like for you to do now is I will give you the end of the story, and we're going to flash forward to the end of this piece and listen to how Strauss uses different timbres and different instruments to depict the end of the story. So in most tellings of Don Juan, there is sort of the final fling that he has, the final woman that he seduces, and her father finds out how she has been treated and can't handle it and confronts Don Juan, and they get into a fight and he kills her father. And so in this piece, you hear, when we fast forward rather, to 16 minutes and 45 seconds is where you're going to go, you'll hear that last climactic moment. You'll hear the last battle, where he has triumphed in his battle, either his seduction of his final woman or in killing her father, right? Kind of arguable. He has succeeded for his final time. And then at about 17 and a half minutes, you hear the point. You hear a shift in the timbre where it gets darker, gets more mellow. The harmony supports this. It gets mellow, or it gets more minor. Sorry. The dynamic, so the how loud or how soft it is, supports this. It gets soft again. You have a moment of realization for Don Juan of what he has truly done. And the last minute of this piece is Don Juan's slow descent into his death without salvation, all the way down to the last few seconds of this. You'll hear musical depictions of his final breaths, this shimmery sound in the strings called a tremolo, where they move their bows very quickly across a string, and then it sounds like a shudder. So you'll hear a big sigh, a big breath, and then a smaller breath, and then plucked strings and single low brass notes depicting his final heartbeats, Don Juan as he dies. Take a listen. All right, so now you should have a list of of words to describe these different sounds, right? Things that you may have heard me modeling throughout the last couple minutes, different ways of describing voices, which we'll get to in a moment, percussive elements. What do drums kind of represent? How do drums sound different than other percussion instruments, other things that are struck, right? Drums tend to be, the bigger they are, the deeper they are, the more kind of ominous they sound, right? Or is it more aggressive and splashy like a cymbal? Or is it lighter and airier like a triangle? Electrophones we'll get to in just a moment, but we tend to hear those as being sort of disingenuine. You know, they're perhaps edgier, they're maybe cleaner, they can be modified, right? So there's a lot of variety with what you can do with electric music. And aerophones are often also associated, just like the chordophones, associated with human elements, because we do on some level associate those with breathing when we know that there's air involved with that. So you've got some different sounds, bright or dark, that we can loosely correlate to each instrument. Right? So our next activity is going to be leaving out of the classical world, analyzing this impact of different timbre decisions, identify which classifications and families were used in each rendition of this song. What is the central message of the song, and which types of timbre seem to best fit that? Right? How does the message change when you change different timbres? So I'd like for you to pause right now and listen to the radio version and this live acoustic version of the exact same song. This is Pink, What About Us? And identify what the mood is. So in general, we have this kind of angry, sad mood. But how are the colors of angry and sad modified by the fact that one of them is more electric and one of them is more acoustic? So go ahead and listen to those two and compare. Generally speaking, when we're talking about live performances, most people associate those with being a more extreme version of the emotional content that was originally presented in the pre-recorded version, right? Because we have this kind of raw, almost gravelly maybe quality to the voice when we hear it live versus it's more pure, more processed from an electric standpoint. And so in this case, if you have something that is sad, it becomes heartbreaking. If you have something that's angry, it becomes furious. And so everything is intensified by most perceptions, right, when we go from a pre-recorded to a live version. Some people now tend to prefer a pre-recorded version because you can guarantee certain amounts of perfection. You can do things with electronic manipulation that are not possible in live performances. So your experience as a listener changes drastically as we associate with different kinds of timbres. Right? Similarly, if you have a song that has a wide array of timbres versus a song that has a relatively narrow array of timbres, you can get different impacts. So go ahead and take a second and just make some notes about the things that you notice timbrally. How does this exact same song have a slightly different message or have a different appeal to it? Who might enjoy the original version versus who might be drawn, rather, who might be drawn to the cover. So go ahead and listen just a minute or so for the beginning of Bastille's version and then the cover of Pentatonics of the same song. So you've got a couple different target audience members, right? Aside from just people who like the original band and people who like the cover band, right? There are different types of listeners and different types of environments where one would be more appropriate than another. This starts to sort of set the scene for what we'll do in the second half of this semester with why do we like music we do. You might have a preference for the types of timbres that are in the original. You like electric guitar, you like the sound of the lead singer's voice. You're not a fan of a cappella music because you prefer that percussive sounds come from traditionally percussive instruments. That's a legitimate observation, but there are particular places where some of these may be more appropriate than others, and there are particular people who just have opposite preferences. Right, so we're talking about impersonal value, whether or not these songs are well constructed, whether or not the timbres convey a message that is in line with the original intent. And then, is it personally valuable to you? Do you find one of these a more valuable or a more telling rendition of the song? Similarly, we can talk about original versions, covers, remixes. As we listen to all three of these, you'll notice very distinct changes in what types of instruments are being used, as well as what other elements are changed. So go ahead and pause this video and jump over to the original and the first cover, so the Jimmy Fallon and the Roots cover of Blurred Lines, and just compare what you're hearing there. So the changes between the original and the second one, obviously we've got all these kind of funny little classroom instruments. You see the banana shaker and the the colored xylophone, and this to me is one of the more disturbing covers that I could find because we have such such a strong contrast between the intent of the original song and the message and what is being conveyed specifically by the instruments that are being used in the cover. Right. So if you had not listened to the words, or if you don't know the words, if you've never heard this song before, go check out some lyrics or go back and re-listen to some of the verses of Blurred Lines and get a sense of what kind of adult subject matter we're talking about. Adult and rather questionable, right, subject matter. And now this is portrayed in the cover with instruments that are played by children, right? Sounds that are in a melodic range that are more narrow and higher. So we associate that with a certain levity, with a certain lightness. It sounds almost kind of like they're tossing off the sincerity or the severity of the various types of messages that could be conveyed. Right? It's a very light-hearted presentation, timbrely speaking, of not a light-hearted song, which can be create quite a bit of cognitive dissonance. In contrast, go back and listen just a clip at the beginning and refresh your memory of what kind of instruments were used there, what that one sounded like, and then jump over to the remix and listen to what's going on there, particularly as we start to factor in some of the other elements like rhythm. So the original and the remix use very similar instruments, but we do have quite a bit more electronic manipulation in the remix, which is pretty characteristic, right? It removes even more than the original, removes the human element. Also kind of disturbing when we think about the subject matter, that there's an inhuman element to having songs that are purely electronic where the voice is manipulated, right? It sounds like it sounds very smooth and cold. Then rhythmically, this is this is added to the fact that there's a really heavy emphasis on downbeats, so it's got a very heavy feel to it. There's a very slow ostinato. You get a couple moments of sort of that beat dropping, where you get a couple heavier moments rhythmically that add to the sense of gravity. And we often use this as dance music, right? Something that implies an up and down. If you have a narrow range of timbres, but a wide range in the melody, very high and low, and kind of jumping and thudding around, then this creates kind of a stomping effect, right? That's how a lot of remixes are successful in what they do. So you've got this original lyrics that then take on a a slightly different meaning, and sometimes a very different meaning based upon simply what instruments you're using to convey them. So, with this in mind, you can have a personal preference for an original song as an artist intended, or as something where someone has taken some artistic license, right, and potentially interpreted another way, as we see in real extremes here with the classroom instruments, or with a heavier, slower remix. And then similarly, if we go back to these options, right, you might have a preference for live music that's a little riskier, shall we say, from a music quality standpoint. You're not really guaranteed to get the same thing every time, but you also won't get the same thing every time, right? So you get potentially a more raw timbre. Those acoustic sounds, again, we associate with being more truly emotional, regardless of what the emotion is. They sound more human in a way. But if you are looking for a consistent product, a perfect product, something that has been crafted, then oftentimes that's the function of recording. People will record in order to quality control, in essence, right? Or in order to manipulate the sound in a way that you simply can't do with live performers that loop themselves over and over again when they obviously can't perform multiple parts at the same time. Right? So you have a lot of different options that we'll listen to as we get into some of the next half of the semester with your experience as a listener. But a lot of times what timbres are used are the things that can be the most controlling over what we experience as a listener. So your task over the weekend is to listen to this first half. We're going to go back into the Western classical world of the Romeo and Juliet Fantasy Overture. It should be about 11 minutes of music. It's by a composer named Tchaikovsky. He's a Russian late Romantic composer. And we all are more familiar with the story of Romeo and Juliet than Don Juan, right? So your task is to identify these three main themes orally, A-U-R-A-L. Listen for the three main themes that are presented. They very loosely represent Friar Lawrence at about 15 seconds, the feud between the Montagues and Capulets just under 6 minutes in, and then the love between Romeo and Juliet, the balcony scene, at about 8 minutes in. So identify those three different characters, and your task is to discuss how Tchaikovsky creates them with each of these musical elements. This is including but not limited to timbre. So all the ones that we've covered so far, different elements of rhythm, melody, harmony, and now timbre. How are those decisions made to represent a friar? That's a different timbre than a feuding family. What instruments are being used for a calm friar in his abbey versus a family feud with people killing each other in the streets? How is the rhythm different when depicting a feud than when depicting a declaration of love? How is the harmony? Can you tell the difference between major and minor harmonies? Is one in major and one in minor? What does that suggest? Does one of the melodies move more solemnly, more evenly than is one more disjunct than the other? Is one more aggressive sounding because of its leaps and its contour? What instruments are being used for each of these, and what timbres do those have to represent the wise friar, the angry families, and just the love-struck teenagers? So those are your foods for thought, if you will, for the discussion board this weekend. Again, thank you for listening to this video. For your attendance today, I would like for you to jump onto that exit ticket. I can kind of see who's opened the video and how long you watched it, but jump onto the exit ticket, and your code word for today is going to be jazz, in honor of us getting booted from our room by that jazz festival. J-A-Z-Z, jazz, is your code word for today. And under the question for the day, I would like for you to give me just a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what your story was for Don Juan. So who were your characters, and what did they do? Was there a battle? Was somebody in love? Was somebody heartbroken? What happened in your story? Again, just 1 or 2 sentences so I can get a loose idea of what happened in your Don Juan. Thank you for your flexibility with this class day and for your understanding. I know that this is not our ideal situation, but our relationship, particularly with the university and with the community, and with our School of Music and the schools that come in for this festival, are really important. It's a very important public service that we do to make these kinds of opportunities available for community members and for high school students and their teachers all around the state. So this is a small sacrifice for us to make and hopefully you're able to fast forward and maybe get a little flexibility with your time this afternoon. So I look forward to seeing you next week. And as a reminder, I have some bonus office hours that I've added tomorrow if you feel confused or shortchanged with this video lecture. And I will also open our next class period with some time for questions if you want to ask in that setting as well. So have a great weekend, and I will see you next week.